Okay, here's some notes on the Ontology essay by André Bazin. This is a picture of I think it was 1967 book of essays, is when it was translated into English, a famous translation by Hugh Gray. So Bazin was a French critic and intellectual. He wrote for tons of newspapers, lots of reviews. He was one of the co-founders of a film magazine called Cahiers du Cinéma, like one of the major French film magazines. Reviewed all kinds of movies. All the new wave film directors wrote for it too, and were influenced by Bazin, of course. He died pretty young in '58, and right in '58 was this. I think he wrote that essay in '44, ontology essay, and then it came out in this. Right, the year that he died, he published the What is Cinema in French, and then 10 years later, it came out in the U.S. The main thesis of this particular essay is that, and his work in general, is that true cinema reveals pieces of reality in duration. So what he thinks artistic cinema is, what it does, or what it should do, it should be realist. It should reveal reality, not just a flat image of things, but of things in duration. Not the whole picture, but important pieces. So true cinema reveals particular pieces of reality in duration. Basic principle is that art is satisfying the psychological need to preserve the essential being of things. So where do I come up with that essential being of things? Well, ontology, that means the science of being. It's part of metaphysics. Could be confused with oncology, which is the science of tumors. So if your cancer your cancer doctor is called an oncologist. The ontology is the being of something. So their essential being. Just a fancy philosophical word. Mummy complex. So he starts out talking about, the most ancient art is trying to preserve being, preserve the essential being of, in this case, the pharaoh. Mummification is a kind of embalming, trying to preserve the pharaoh, ostensibly for the next life. And this is the King Tut's sarcophagus here. Bazin sees this psychological need as, man trying to overcome death, trying to overcome time. If you can preserve something, this is what art is trying to do. This is one important function of art. He actually sees two sociological functions for art that are mixed. There's symbols of inner and spiritual reality, and then there's realism, the external world, that art is trying to also preserve that. And he says that, up until photography, art would always balance these two functions. And he talks about medieval art as being, example of a kind of balance between these two. Here, this is an illuminated manuscript from Vatican. It's sort of realist. We have an image of a person sitting in a place. We get some idea of an actual place there, but why is there a huge bird on his head, right behind his head? What in the world is going on there? It's awfully symmetrical. Clearly, there's some symbolic aspect of this picture here. And you may know this is one of the evangelists, the writers of the gospel, the key books of the New Testament of the Bible. And if I had looked this up, if you know, each one of them had a different symbol. This is John, whose symbol was the eagle. So, the eagle there has nothing to do with reality. It's a pure, spiritual symbol of, John in his gospel representing, the air and coming close to the sun and all those kinds of things. So you see there's this kind of balance of showing what an eagle actually looks like versus the symbolic value of the eagle. Okay. Then Bazin starts to talk about how there starts to be a tension with when we get to more modern art here in the Renaissance between the symbolic and the realist function. He talks about Da Vinci. So here's Da Vinci's The Last Supper. Obviously, much more realistic. We don't have a bunch of symbols, halos and like we had the birds in the medieval there. It looks like this could actually be people gathered in for a supper. They all happen to be very, white-looking Northern Italians, which is definitely not realist. But as if, the Italian imagination of this biblical scene is just how they would see real Italian life. And so there's this conflict between, the symbol that's going on here and trying to display reality. So you see the perspective, how we get this kind of space. And part of what, this is at a convent on the wall of a church in Milan. You see the person standing in front of it. It's huge. Part of what that perspective is trying to do is give you this illusion of being inside it, which is interesting and quite a bit different from the medieval painting. Okay, he talks about how early on he just mentions Louis XIV. He didn't need a sarcophagus because he was content to be preserved in the portrait by Lebrun. So here's Lebrun's portrait, and this is classical painting. It feels, we would say, very photographic today because it's so close to reality. It's probably idealized, of course, but it's a plausible representation of what someone could look like, much more than kind of the symbolic importance. Now let's jump forward to Matisse in modern art in 1907, painting his wife, Amélie. You could see why when modern art came along, people said, "Oh, it's terrible." There's it's a terrible likeness. But what Bazin sees is there's in fact this conflict between style, the symbolic, spiritual side of art, and the realistic side. So here, I'll put side by side a photograph of Matisse, his wife, and his daughter. She's in the middle, and then the painting on the left. And if you think of, and in many ways, the painting is much better. It might not look like her, but it's much more expressive. It has a lot more feeling. It feels like it tells me a lot more of, how Matisse feels about her, and maybe what her character is than I get out of that photograph. So that side by side is a good way to just illustrate what Bazin is trying to say for how he sees art's sociological functions. They used to be mixed, this between the symbolism and realism. Now he says once photography is invented, they become separated. Painting is free to just be pure symbol, pure inner world. It doesn't have to be realistic anymore. Photography will take care of the realism for it. So this makes kind of a new kind of it changes painting and what painting is doing, and it also makes photography almost a new kind of art. Now, cinema is a little bit different than photography in that it's not a still image. It's preserving duration. So says it embalms time. That we don't just have an instant image of a thing, but a thing has duration in time. It's objectivity in time, the image of the duration of things. So there's that difference between photography. Time is key. So with this different kind of art of photography and cinema, what the artist is doing, rather than focusing on expressing his the spiritual or inner life so much, he's more focused on the external world, selecting specific things that are meaningful, that are beautiful, that are poignant, and if the artist this is a picture of Jean Renoir, one of his favorite film directors. If the artist does a good job, they're going to reveal that reality in a way that's totally the opposite of painting. It's going to strip away all of the, spiritual side. He says it strips it of the spiritual dust and grime. We don't have all the preconceptions and symbols laying things down, but it's going to give us reality as it actually is, and force us to confront that by putting it outside of us. Now, it isn't necessarily, he talks about surrealism, just to make the point that photography is not necessarily, devoid of imagination. Here is a surrealist photograph. It's actually called a rayograph by Man Ray, called Feather and Matchboxes, 1923. It's called Feather and Matchboxes because it isn't through a lens. He put photographic paper down, set a feather on it, and some matchboxes and other objects to create, a surrealist, a very zany image. You have to dream on this. And maybe some substances could help you make sense of it. You can see the feather in the matchboxes when you look, but otherwise it is a very strange image. Bazin describes surrealism as a hallucination that is also a fact. So there's the fact of these actual objects that are on this thing, but it's revealing, something that's maybe more imaginative, maybe a different way of thinking about these objects as well. So, to come back to the main thesis, true cinema, what he thinks is good cinema is revealing reality, specific pieces of it in duration, and so cinema is really tied to this psychological need that man has to preserve the essential being. The essential being of whatever thing it is that's photographed is captured in that photograph, just like the old magic of a mummy preserving the essential being. This technology can actually keep the image, or so Bazin would like to believe. Some people might say differently. What this means for the kind of style that Bazin likes, which is called realism, means he's into the long take because of duration. At the same time, he's into staging in depth. So rather than, editing and a bunch of things on the surface of the image, he wants, to dive into the reality, this actual world that's being photographed. Or even a studio world, but this sense of depth and being in that world is what's important. Here's an image from a famous film you may know called Citizen Kane, directed by Orson Welles. Um, the It's really famous for its deep focus and some of the tricks that they did. And here, at the beginning of the movie, there's this focus. The focus goes all the way to, little Charlie Kane playing out in the window there as his mother is, kind of cold-heartedly signing the papers that will give put the money in a trust and give her son away, send him off to boarding school and everything. So there's a lot that's told in that reality of that social situation, of the relationships between the characters, by putting it in depth. So he's into improvisation, especially in acting and chance, and the kind of relationships that are happening there on screen as they're being recorded in real time. And that is Bazin's realism.